Hello, welcome back. Now we have, to me, the most exciting part of the day. It's the Fireside Chat, which, for those of you who haven't followed the Fireside Chat, we've run it for the last several performance days. It's an opportunity to sit down with a major influencer within the industry. The influencers always have sustainability traits to them. And for some time, I've been trying to tempt in someone who's given me an awful lot of inspiration. We've already had the North Face, Patagonia, Fjällräven, the European Outdoor Group. We now have Pamela, and Pamela will talk about herself quite shortly. But what I want to remind everyone is that we can talk and we can go off on tangents all day long, but this is your opportunity to make an interactive presentation. The Slido question bar on the side of the screen, or if it's not on the side of the screen, go to the bottom of the screen where it says view more, and Slido will come up and you can have your questions direct to the conversation here. But otherwise we're going to sit around and just chat about 101 odd things. So I've got some questions to kick off, but Pamela, I've known you from being a computer whiz kid. You first came onto my radar when when your blog won the Observer Award, which, you know, I was just amazed. Your blog on the frustrations within the fashion industry. Of course, then you became a very serious writer working with John Mowbray in Eco Textile News, which to me was the default publication. Then you put sustainability into the European Outdoor Group. It was always there, but it was never organised. And you were able to bring everything together. And now you've progressed even further. Technically, you're the person who, almost if I rather cheekily say, you're the board member that people can bring in. So you talk at the very high level to get everyone to match their practice to where they say their morals and ethics are. So that sounds amazing. But Pamela, what bits have I missed out?
Very little. First of all, many thanks, Charles, for the very kind words. You did make a really nice introduction, also sort of making that breadth of, you know, how does a former computer science PhD convert into working in sustainability operations and strategy. And a lot of it is a bit haphazard, as in life just happens while you're busy planning it. So how did that happen? By interest, by coincidence, and I guess by a very innate need to make a difference. Part of it has just to do with, let's say, my family background. My parents are children of World War II. That means, you know, they're also both working class in the best sense of the word, which means, you know, the family has seen really the bottom end, the belly of society and what happened after the World Wars. So in that sense, I've seen a number of things in real life, not so far away as Asia, but actually in front of our own doors. I think that's probably what's kind of fundamentally driving me to believe that each of us can and should be doing a contribution to make everyone's life better, our life better, but also certainly live within the means that this planet is giving us to have a good life.
Now, the trend at the moment, certainly all this millennium within apparel, has been to try and reduce the negative effects of what we do so we aren't so damaging. And the reason why I was attracted to what you say is what you have just said in your final statement. You actually want people to flip, and rather than making life less bad, you want people to make life good for other people. And I think that's a wonderful approach. Now, on the back of that, hopefully we're going to go through, I've got a load of questions going on. We've got Slido coming in for the additional questions, but some people were so keen to pick your brain. They were emailing me. So before the Performance Days system came up, and a key question, and I'm sorry, this is a really hard one. This is right in at the deep end. Can we have a truly sustainable brand in the current system? Do we need to decouple profit from growth to achieve true sustainability? So, wow, I mean, we could talk for 2 hours on that. But yeah, can we have a truly sustainable brand in the current system? Do we need to decouple profit from growth to achieve true sustainability?
So to the first question, on the risk of ruffling a fair few feathers, I would have a fairly clear-cut answer, and the answer is no.
Okay.
There is no way that brands, or any company really, not just brands, so this is agnostic to any industry I'm aware of at this moment within the current system, it's impossible to be genuinely sustainable, as in living within the boundaries that we have, and on top of that, genuinely contributing to a better life within society.
So the boundaries is laid out by someone like Kate Raworth within donut
exactly. So
economics.
If you think about donut economics, there's just nothing, not a single company genuinely today, I think, that moves in that middle donut piece. It's like they're either inside or outside, or whichever way you want to look at that. So as of today, as we are speaking, as of today, Thursday, 2:20 CET Munich time, I don't think, I'm happy to be corrected on that, it's possible or it exists.
So the business model is not serving us. If I reinterpret those
it's
words.
not the business model, it's the economic model that we have does not serve what it should. It was okay, it was functional, let's put it that way, in the days when there were few people relatively to loads of natural resources, albeit we do know out of history, if you go back wherever you want to go, if you look at Industrial Revolution and sort of the social context in that sense, that there was always social problems. But if we're just looking at the environmental dimension, so the planetary boundary dimensions, it kind of worked within, and that was just because the number of people and resources that had to be consumed in order to maintain the system, as it were, historically, was not big enough to absorb that much as we're drawing today. Now, that has flipped. In my lifetime, we've gone from, I think it's 6 billion people to we're closing in on 8. Yeah. We're probably going to be by about 10 by the end of the century, and then we'll see what's going to be happening from there. It's most possibly past my time. So, I mean, we weren't anywhere near those numbers back in those days, so there wasn't the pressure on the system, and in a sense, the system had an opportunity to regenerate, and they were just talking natural resources, not social resources. So this is why it's like the economic system, as in many industrial problems, scale is a real issue. And the scale we've achieved doesn't work with the resources we have. And it's as simple as that. So we need to find somehow else to work it at the scale we have at this moment.
The piece of news which I picked up this morning is in 2020, we flipped from the weight of man-made resources in this world. So if you look at concrete, if you look at steel, if you look at bricks, being more than the weight of natural resources on the whole planet. And that just woke up to me, and I suddenly thought, this is really serious now. We are outgoing any potential Gaia from the planet to put us back. And we've seen the Gaia from the planet last year during lockdown, when places like India could suddenly see the Himalayas. So if I progress this question, has the planet demonstrated to us it is actually going to survive? And should our question actually be not the concern for environmental status of the planet, but is humankind able to survive on this planet with our current practice?
I mean, it isn't about survival of the planet. The planet will just be doing fine. It's about the survival of the human species. Okay. And to put it more concretely, I mean, if you have children, you might still see your grandchildren, possibly your great-grandchildren, but fundamentally, if we're talking economics and economic system or business and the success of a business, unless you're sure that your business, your economy, whatever, is great-great-grandchildren fit and compatible, you haven't got a business case. And that's what we're talking about. The planet will be doing fine. It'll come back with a different set of species. We had, there were dominant species over time and the billions of years. right now it's the Homo sapiens. For how much longer, that is the question.
That's a pretty big concept. So I'm going to move away from the serious questions just to let all of that sink into the audience. And I'm going to ask you lots of small questions. Like, I want to know what the work that you did at the European Outdoor Group, the legacy you left behind, which bit are you most proud of?
Oh, that's very easy. It's the team that's doing the work right now.
So it's Katie. Katie, we love you.
It's
Katie, Jane, Verity, and the whole...
Well, it's Katie, Jane, Verity, and in particular, Katie, who's taken over from me. I mean, what she's achieving with the team, what she's managed to push forward, the context she's working in, notably now in COVID times with also limited resources. I mean, it's just really, really great what she's doing. She's achieved a lot. In getting brands to commit and in being the industry even more outspoken than it used to be. So if there's one thing I would say is like it's the people behind that are running it now.
Brilliant. And for those of you who want to find out more about Katie, go into the archive of the Performance Days talks, and she was actually the interviewer in the Fireside Chat at the last event, and she had a much better backdrop than we have here. So another short question. The first step companies should do if they want to have better practice?
Well, my view on that one is actually quite simple. What you can't measure, you can't manage. So you need to know where you are now and how you measure that. And that's the first step. If you don't manage to put those ducks in a row, everything beyond that is a bit hard.
Great. Know where you are. How about the better practice question? We indicated it in the opening question. Can we become a sustainable brand if our model of selling stuff is how we make profit? What other suggestions would you suggest we should look at?
I mean, the fundamental question behind that is, how do you define success?
Okay.
Both as a economy in a global sense, but as a company very specifically. Now, if we leave the global economic piece by side, because that's a really tough nut to crack, as a company, it does open the question of how do you define success? So, do you define success by your P&L? Do you define success by whether it's single or double-digit growth over a year, and if it's growth, what growth are you looking for? It's like, are you looking growth in jobs created, growth in stuff thrown through the door, growth in number of offices? Okay. So I think the fundamental question is, how do you define success? And if you look around, there are companies who, beyond just the mere you have to survive bottom line P&L, do look at much more interesting and also challenging concept of what success is. So if we think about, say, a small brand, I've got a very specific name in my head, of tea. If their definition of success is how many more livelihoods of tea growers in underprivileged areas of this world, on the one hand, they can give a livelihood to, and on the other hand, how many people in what today is the global north they can wean off tea bags, that is an interesting way of how to define what success could mean. Now, yes, they have to survive, they have to sort of, in the system wherein you have to have a P&L and a bottom line that at least gives you a black zero. But there are other dimensions that are open for any company and, in fact, any individual to define what success means.
And on the back of that, if you go to the Functional Fabric Fair website, go for the talk with Pasha Whitmire from Patagonia, and we start to talk about regenerative agriculture, even though he's a synthetic lead. But he made a very interesting observation. There are 4 factors around regenerative agriculture, and he put in a 5th. And he said the restoration of the local trading community. And he said that was actually more important than the numbers from various other aspects. And it's to me, that was showing the true ethics of how the brand wants to change the society that it's in. Now, on the back of that, if I was to challenge you with a simple question, should we all be aiming to become a B Corporation company?
I mean, there are two questions inside
I asked
there.
a really short question, and it's a big answer.
It's a big answer. I mean, there are two questions in there. It's like, does everyone have to go through a certification process that ends up on a stamp on your front door called B Corp? The answer to that is no. Do we as businesses, as society, as cities, towns need a framework of thought that looks at many more dimensions than just the profit and loss accounts? By all means. There are a few of them out there. Some of them are more targeting the public sector and sort of public life, if you want. So we're talking regions, cities, countries, towns. There's some that look specifically at companies. I'm not partial to one or the other. I mean, there are a couple of ingredients that you need. You need to have governance covered. You need to have either, well, something in the line of goals within what the planetary boundaries is in terms of carbon and biodiversity, that's science-based targets. You need ingrained ability to not just measure where you are, but measure progress. And not just in environmental terms, but also in terms of social contribution. So to your point, what does that mean for local communities? What does that mean if it's not local communities, if you local to yourself? What about the local community to where you produce or where you get resources? And you have to have a component therein that is about reporting and sort of, I'm not mentioning compliance because I presume compliance both in legal terms and in sort of just proving what you claim is a given.
But that's also one of your skills. And I know that's what you do to various companies. You actually join the dots. So that's the magic. And at this stage, I should also confess, those people who have heard me present before, I always used to say the most sustainable company is the most profitable company, because you need to be here this year and the next year and the year afterwards to lead everyone on the journey. Since speaking to Pamela, I now changed the set of words because you have redefined what profit is to me, and I'm very grateful for that. But I'm looking at the question line, by the way. Please do send in the Slido questions. But Pamela, next question down. Sustainability. Is it a word that means nothing? Is it the wrong word for what we're doing?
I mean, it used to mean a lot, and the term has undergone a significant transformation over the decades. From, if you go back a fair few decades, sustainability was just the financial survival of a company. Then it went into sustainable development with the famous report out of the UN. And it went from there. And every few years, it gets a slightly different nuance, a slightly different buzz feel to it. Other words come in, some words go out. But to revert back what I said before, it was like maybe a more colloquial but also more intuitive way is to say, well, what you're looking at is great-grandchildren, or if you prefer, great-great-grandchildren fit, or great-great-children compatible. So something that, even if you're gone, your offspring and will still be there here, and they will have a good life within what the current context for them is. And I think that is maybe a bit more intuitive way how to think about it, in particular if you've got children.
So should we use the word responsibility? An attitude with a responsible attitude. Is there a particular word which you think could replace sustainable at the moment?
I mean, all the words come and go. They've got buzzers, they haven't got buzzers. So that's why, and the terminology of great-great-grandchildren compatible isn't actually my coining. I've picked. I'm borrowing this from someone I've talked to in the summer. And I think, in many ways, if you're not too keen on all the buzzwords and you don't believe in, green and eco and whatnot, but if you think about, you want to have your own legacy as a human being survive, in essence, your genes after you're gone and whatever, and whoever is within that family tree of yours to have a good life, maybe that's an easier way how to think about it. And it's certainly a much more intuitive way. Because if you just think how much change we've had in our lifetimes, we have no way of knowing how in 100 years life genuinely will look like. But if your assumption is that you want to give your great-great-grandchildren the best possible opportunity to live comfortable lives, to live good lives, to live profitable life, as in not just, scrambling for stuff, but not having to fight for it either. I think that's a different way how to look at it. And certainly in that way, once you go beyond your own lifespan thinking, and this is hard for many of us to grasp still, because we're kind of short-sighted as a species. That sort of puts things into perspective, I think.
Well, on the subject of particular words, one I want to bring up, which haunts the work that you're around the whole time, is greenwashing. I don't consider greenwashing a problem. I think greenwashing is always going to go on. I know there's European legislation that's going to make some lawyers very rich about it, but I think it's a distraction that people are using as an excuse. What are your views on greenwashing? I just believe we should push on with the work we're doing, and if someone wants to start talking strange stuff, just to keep on pushing through.
There are two sides to a coin, right? There are, in principle, I'm entirely of your opinion. Is like, why bother about those that talk and don't do? Just get stuff done and prove that you've done it. Now, and this goes back to a bit sort of the economic system we're in, is if there is possibility to sell stuff under bad label, whether that is medication, and that has nothing to do with eco, but medication with the wrong ingredients, so it's poisonous, or something that's supposed to be, more green, eco-sustainable, more responsible, whatever the terminology you choose to use, and it isn't, then obviously that should have consequences for those that have done it intentionally with knowledge. Now that's sort of where obviously that thin red line is, how do you prove it's one way or the other? But the moment that you make undue profit out of that, it should have consequences. It has had consequences in other areas. So, if you put rotten ingredients, horse meat into, and
Am I British?
And sell it under another label and make profit out of that. So knowingly making profit out of deceiving and pulling people's legs, that should have consequences. And that's not so much about greenwashing or not. That's just irresponsible, unaccountable behavior that just doesn't fit into a society that we really want to be.
I'm happy with what you're saying. And I like the idea that social media has the power to destroy reputations that have taken decades or even hundreds of years to reach their status, because of the foolish things that the board are allowing to happen within their company.
But I mean, to that point, an interesting one is it's also being abused at this point of the day. So we do see scandals on in sort of quotation marks that aren't really scandals, but it's someone that is just unhappy, annoyed, because they don't get their way, and they take it out on social media and undermine someone's well-earned and hard-earned reputation. That again, I mean, it does raise questions on what is good manners and fairness in that context, and something I don't think we've got a clear grasp of as of now just yet.
As a Briton who has to suffer our current political system, I can only but agree with you. If I move on the subject before we get too controversial, what's more important? And I'm giving you an impossible question: social responsibility or environmental concern? If you had to choose between the two.
I mean, they're one and the same. I mean, they generally are. Okay. If you think about it, if you screw up environment, people suffer. If people suffer, they don't have the option to think about the environment. So they go hand in hand, and it's for good reason that, say, whether you look at B Corp, at the SDGs, or they're always sort of balancing one with the other. If there's no social justice, there's no potential to wrap your head around. And if you're scrambling just to survive, to get food on the table, whatever, there's hardly bandwidth to deal with anything else beyond just your own survival. And equally, if you're just as greedy to screw up whatever environment you're in, sort of landscape, biodiverse area, fundamentally what you do is you shoot through your own foot, because you make it impossible to have a good life. So it's not two things, it's actually the very same coin. And it's for a good reason that whenever we're talking about, weaning ourselves off petrol and oil, that there's that word that is floating around and buzzing around these days, the just transition. And that's a precise reason. You can't wean off the whole global society of carbon and the type of petrols that we're using right now without thinking that there is going to be, or there still is these days, people, societies, communities that don't even have access to energy. So how do you do that when you want people to be able to live without having to go for hours to get water, to get wood, whatever else it is? So it is really two sides. Don't have a lighting
system that they can
exactly. Operate. They can't go to school because they can't do the transport, it's miles away. They can't do homework because there's no light after a certain time in the day. So I think the two are really two coins of the same.
Now, Pamela, on that, you've travelled the world. It's not something you reveal very often. From all your travels in the world, you've been to some really interesting and some really what I would describe as ugly places. What places have left the biggest memory with you, either that have motivated you to do more good or have just shocked you to bits?
Well, it's interesting that you ask, because I really have been to a fair few places around the world, and many of the places I've seen really quite abhorrent poverty and situation people are living in. But I guess the one thing that until this day has left the deepest mark on me is actually not so far away. Some people may know that my mother's born and bred Spanish, from an area in the northwest of Spain, Galicia. And I do remember as a child, we were there, and just for a context, Galicia is an area where in the 60s there was so little work that people were migrating overseas. Okay. So there was no work. Spain had very little work, and you could either manage to come to Central Europe if you're lucky, or many people at the time would take the big overseas ship and go to Argentina, to Chile, to Brazil. And it showed through to the 80s. Now we're literally in a completely different country. But I do remember when I was a child, so we're talking early 80s, that there were beggars in the city where my mom has grown up. And the picture that I still see up until today is a mother with a very, very, very small child. And the child just would not stop crying and would not stop crying. And the mother was haggardly tiny. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could see that she was very malnourished. You could see that there wasn't much that she could give the child. And I mean, I must have been maybe 6 or 7 at the time, but just those cries of that child are staying with me until today. And probably also because of the age. Mm-hmm. It's never been anything quite as difficult to digest thereafter.
So it was more the shock that a society would let this situation exist within it?
No, it's actually I could feel the pain of the child.
Okay.
And I think this is what's staying with me, is that feeling, that sort of heart-wrenching feeling that, in particular being a child, how you can't change anything. It's like you're too young to do anything. Mm-hmm. But you see that something needs to be done and you can't. And that disempowerment in that moment has stayed with me to the day, and it's never come, anything really has lived up to the feeling I had back in those days. Not the poverty I've seen in Tibet, not the poverty I've seen in the slums in either South America or India. Not some of the destructions I've seen in those countries, not in sort of the misery that some of the Japanese day laborers have their old age lived in. It's nothing has ever felt quite as gut-wrenching as that.
Okay. I want to go back to a point we said earlier so we don't get too emotionally wound up about this. Jessica, thank you for this question. Do you think companies greenwash with intent, or is it more a lack of knowledge and ignorance?
It's both. I mean, there are some that do it by just being stupid.
Okay.
Or educated, ignorant, but I have absolutely no doubt, and I have a few sort of thoughts sort of in the back of my brain as I say that some of that is done by absolute purpose intent. So you get both.
Fair one. I just believe everyone's genuinely good, and I know that's one of my weak points. To progress the subject on, do we accept the answers given to us too readily? Or is it because we're not asking good enough questions of others? So are we living in a world where we now have 1,000 marketing messages a day are sent to us? And although we're cynical to them, do we accept too many of them? Or is it because we're lazy and we're not asking better questions?
All of that, and we're overwhelmed.
Okay.
Maybe 30 years ago would have been a different story. But I mean, these days, you open whatever, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever social media you aren't on, and you get swamped by any claims. And it's like there's just not enough hours in the day to question all of that. So the best you can do if it matters, so whether you buy chocolate, tea, garments, it doesn't matter. It's like when it matters, when you take out your purse and buy, that's the moment to ask questions. And then there's the time to do that. Okay. But other than that, it's like how many hours does half the day and how many things need to be done in a day? It's like there's a life to be lived.
That's a very good point. And we're almost, because we're in this information age, we're almost overloaded with the amount of information. Now, if I could actually highlight something that you do, which you have a newsletter that goes out, a blog which you publish, the Shirahime. Do you want to tell people how they can access it directly? Because if you really want to become as nerdish as I am, this is what you need to read.
Right. So yes, as Charles said, it's like I do have a blog. I have a roughly monthly newsletter. Sometimes it's a month, sometimes it's 6 weeks. It's called Scribblings of a Sunrise CEO, and it is really intended for people, I usually say at the top of the food chain, so people that sit either on a board of a family company typically, or a very small stock-listed company to sort of get an idea of what's happening right now in terms of trends, what kind of topics are coming up. It's quite easy to digest. At the surface, you can dig deep on a lot of it if you really intended to, but you can also digest it in a matter of about 10 minutes or so. If you want to sign up to that, you can go to shirahime.ch. That is SHIRAHIME, Shirahime for White Princess in Japanese.ch. And you'll see there's a sign-up letter, a sign-up field for the newsletter.
And if that doesn't make sense, it enables you to ask better questions. And that's why I read it. I realize I'm focused on too much of the minutiae, and I should be taking the whole picture, the holistic picture into concern. But running on from that, what I want to do, because we can still take questions in, but I want to ask you more about, how can I put this easily? Using all your wisdom, what would you change if you were back to being a teenager now and you were going to go in the same direction? So you were going to enter to be, it's the wrong set of words, a sustainability guru. If you wanted to work properly within this industry, what skills do you wish that you'd learned at that stage?
I mean, it's a very good and at the same time very hard question because times were different at the time. You know, it was like I went to high school. Oh God, that says how old I am. I went to primary in the 80s, high school in the late 80s, early 90s, studied second half of the 90s. Back in those days, most of the people would do economics, then maybe law, and then some weirdos would go down the engineering path. So back in those days, yes, there was environmental science, but you know, those were the people that would deal with landfills, incinerators, maybe drainage systems on the sides of rivers and so on to prevent flooding. So it wasn't a particularly cool discipline to do environmental science at the time, and you would certainly not think of sustainability related to environmental science the way we would think. So with that in mind, what would I do different? I guess the one thing that I would do certainly different is I probably would do my PhD in a different area if I were to do a PhD again. Rather than sustainability, which is sort of interface and how people interface with information, maybe something more using, you know, back in those days already the beginning of traceability technology was going around. We didn't talk about blockchain back in those days, but about GS1 and integrated databases and distributed databases and things like that. So I guess that could have been a much more interesting way to go by that even today. Would come in handy. I would still not program. I'm not particularly talented at that. I'd still do systems analysis, what basically is what I do today. So I guess with the same setting, there would have been a couple of slight differences. But given the time and age, I mean, in a sense, certainly at least in Switzerland, I know in other geographies it's been different. But given the options, I think it didn't pan out too badly.
Brilliant. Richard, thank you for this question. You've actually seen my notes. It's the next question on the list that I've scribbled for Pamela. The main title of this presentation is the industry moving fast enough to solutions? And Richard's asked that exact question with a yes or no. I'm not going to get a yes or no. I want to know why as well. Sorry, Richard, we're expanding on what you're asking for. Is the industry getting off its butt and doing enough now?
So if I have to do it binary, it's a no.
Okay. How far are we away from a tipping point to a yes?
So there are two things. Tipping point, we might just be at the tipping point. Okay. But if you take as a measure, does the industry do enough? Planetary boundary, science-based targets, 2030, 2050 deliverables, at least on carbon and biodiversity? The answer is no. Yes, some of the outliers at the top end, they do have the 2030 goals, 2040 goals, and so on and so forth. But if you start to dig into that, you start also to realize that they often depend on other sectors, be it transport and so on and so forth, that at the best of times have 2050 or 2060 goals, or they depend on construction, think logistics center and so on. They still follow a growth pattern of, in some cases, 50% growth over the next 5 years. So in that sense, no, we're the outer sector, but you know, the outer sector certainly isn't an exception at all.
Well, I think the track record of what we did in Asia, where we just went in to sell more product with our ever-expanding middle class, and certainly at the first half of the last decade, that was what kept the industry alive, the profits that we were reaping from selling to the Asians.
And I mean, you can just go back at the example of apparel and look at the statistics of how many individual garments have been produced and sold globally over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and what the per piece average price is. And you see that it's basically an X, as in more stuff produced, prices coming down. And, you know, you don't have to do more than a back of the envelope calculation of how that aligns with science-based targets.
Well, I know that we now all own twice the amount of clothing that we did at the turn of the millennium. and that was doubled from 1970, which I am a kid from that age. Now, that's talking about now and going forward. What I do want to do, whilst we've got you, what wisdom have you picked up? What buzzword have you picked up that you want to investigate more as a potential solution? If this conversation had happened 5 years ago, we would have said something like blockchain. We really need to investigate. But you have so much greater awareness than most of us. What have you heard recently that you've gone, oh, that's interesting. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but I need to have a proper look at.
Well, I think some of the most interesting conversations are happening around technologies, and this has nothing to do with apparel specifically, but again, is for most companies will be relevant at some point. Technologies that take out carbon out of the atmosphere, and there are a number of different technologies. Carbon capture is sort of the big buzzwords around. And up until this moment, I mean, I know companies who do that. They got big investors. They're rolling out their carbon capture facilities in Iceland and elsewhere. I'm not intuitively. It's not clear to me whether at the bottom line that actually is going to be panning out. For a couple of reasons, can they scale quick enough? The second reason being, if you look at individual, and I'm just putting the questions there. I genuinely have no idea because I really just need to figure out what is really going on. They consume evidently energy to take the carbon out. Now, if we look at the carbon balance of energy versus carbon taken out, does it square or does it not square yet, but it may? So I guess it's like if we're thinking about new technologies coming in, that's a bit, I take carbon capture as one example, but I think there's some really interesting question on trade-offs, viability, scalability of a number of those sort of futuristic tech that we may potentially depend on, at least partially. And at this point, I really don't understand the ins and outs and the fine-tuning in it and sort of the side consequences that may or may not drive beneficial use or not of those technologies. And I think it's hugely fascinating. Maybe there's genuine potential, but maybe there isn't. I mean, people invest huge amounts of money, billions of dollars into things like that. So you would automatically assume, of course. But there's always sort of that small print there that you really have to be careful of reading yourself and understanding before you make your own decisions. And I think sort of that's where I'm at. It's like trying to understand, do they make sense? I don't know. Right now, I genuinely don't know.
Well, on the subject of that, and this is unexpected, Stuart, thank you, because I know you're watching over in the States. You know what Stuart I'm talking about,
oh, yes.
But we're not going to mention who you are. I know Stuart is looking at a yarn which is actually made from solidified carbon dioxide. And it could be brilliant. I really hope it's brilliant. But I think the point you brought out about how much we need to balance about how much energy to put in. And it reminds me of Steve, who runs Castle Climbing in London. 20 years ago at the Innovation for Extremes conference, he made a very interesting point about all this offsetting.
Yeah.
He said, why do we need to offset? We actually need to reduce what we're creating in the first place. So that brings me to the question of insetting. We're working in apparel, we're using energy all around the place. How much more seriously should we take insetting, as in using a green power somewhere along our supply chain, rather than trying to get rid of the guilt with the offsetting payment?
I mean, to quote...
How ready are we to do it?
I'm not sure which of the Swiss big insurance and reinsurers has done that, but I do know it's been quoted in the outdoor industry, do your best, offset the rest. And I think that kind of bubbles it down. And it's not just about energy, it's sort of along the whole thing. Offsetting, besides all the technical problems with it, and not just, are you buying your ticket out of the disaster, but like genuine technically problems with the certificates and all the rest of it, double counting and so on and so forth. Never mind the carbon price, that is a problem. That should be the attitude. It's like fundamentally don't offset. Really don't. Reduction, change management, that's what we're talking about. Okay. Offset is really when you're getting to the point and you're dependent on, I don't know, a certain type of pine wood from the back of your garden that you have to chop down to make your skis. That does obviously not look good on the carbon balance on the short term. So the question is, can you offset by planting more, investing in stoves, whatever? But I mean, anything before that, yeah.
I like the way this is going, because the solution a couple of years ago would be, don't chop down that tree, let's use another material. But the more widespread the LCAs have become, the more we're realizing the alternative materials are actually not as good.
I mean, you always have trade-offs, and I think that's the one thing that we need to learn in these conversations. There is no silver bullet. There will never be. There has never been. It's always trade-offs, and the science is only as good as it is today, and tomorrow it will be better than today, and today is better than yesterday. So we can only take decisions that are to the best of our conscious and knowledge as of today. And it's an assumption that we need to get very comfortable with, that we need to keep learning. And tomorrow we could be wrong. We might learn something that proves our opinion of today, our knowledge of today wrong, and we have to improve. And it's hard to accept, but that's what the business is all about.
Okay. Well, on that point, I think that's a straight between the eyes massive statement. And to me, that very much encompasses so much of the sustainability conversation. We know where we are is bad. We know we need to move away from it, but we can't actually guarantee our final destination. All we know is that in the motion, whilst we're moving, we're going to be retuning that direction as our knowledge level is improving. We'll go somewhere a bit more direct. So I don't want to ruin what you've just said. To close this whole conversation, what message would you like to leave with the audience? If you could pick them all up by the lapels and say, you need to pay attention to this, what's the message with love from Pamela?
With love, think about your great-great-grandchildren and do what you can to make it a good, prosper and fun life for them, no matter where on this planet they might be.
Superb. Pamela, thank you ever so much for being our guest.
Charles.
You've done tremendously. I pity the poor person in the next Fireside Chat.
I'll be doing fine with them.
Thank you. And we're going to be back in 10 minutes with Daniela. So we're just going to take a short break, rearrange things, and we'll be online with Daniela. Thank you for watching.